In this lesson, we'll learn how property pages are utilized within Softimage. Okay, so for this particular example, I'm just going to start with a blank scene here. And let's start by dropping in a piece of geometry. Let's go to Get Primitive, Surface, and we'll just start with something like a sphere. Okay, now whenever we create some kind of an object, any kind of a primitive object, Softimage will pop open this little window. Now this is called a property page. And really, just like the name suggests, this property page is controlling the properties of whatever we currently have active. Really, you can think of a property page as being just sort of an editor window or some kind of an attribute window for whatever we currently have active. So this will be a little bit easier to see if I were to come in and set this to a shaded view. And now within this property page of this sphere, we can start to control things like the radius, the number of subdivisions horizontally and vertically, and so on and so forth. Now, the property pages for any kind of a creation are really going to be very unique depending on the particular object that you drop in. So, for example, we have this property page for this sphere, but if I were to close this out, and let's say, again, just for simplicity's sake, if I go to Get Primitive, Light, and let's just very quickly drop in a point light. And again, with this point light selected, you can see that this new property page is created. This starts to control things like the light type, light color, intensity, and so on and so forth. So if I press the V key on my keyboard to switch to my translate tool, I can grab this light, pick it up, and move it around. Again, with this light selected, we can start to come in here and change things like the actual color of that light if we wanted that to look a little bit different. All right, there we go. And once we're finished, we can just close out that property page, and we're done. Now, at any point in time, we can get our property pages back by just selecting the object and then press the Enter key on your keyboard. You can see that will pop open that property page, and it should automatically change its focus depending on whatever you have selected. Now, that's not a feature that we necessarily have to go with. We can actually lock a property page down. So at the top of your property page, you have these three little icons. Now, over on this far right-hand side, we have this little lock icon. So if I click on that, you can see now, even if I select another object, this property page doesn't update. It'll always stay locked to whatever I currently have active. Now, again, if I set this back to a recycle mode, which is this middle button, now it should automatically change depending on what I have selected. Now, here's actually a really neat little feature. The fact that whenever we're working in a property page, we can actually use these little buttons up top, really just almost like a web browser navigation. So we can actually use this and start to go back and step through any other things that we may have had open within our property pages. So let's say I had, for example, another object that I made, just for example, a polygon cube, let's say. Now, with this property page open, let's say I wanted to go back to the actual light. Well, I could either select it, or I could just use this back button and continue to go back until I get to my light. And again, once I'm at this point, I could go ahead and lock this property page down so that that doesn't disappear. Now, in addition to being able to actually close and go back and forth between these property pages, we can actually have multiple property pages open at the same time. So if I had this one locked, and now let's say I wanted to go back to the property page for this sphere, I can just select it, press the Enter key on my keyboard, and there we go. Now I can actually have both of these open at the same time. Now if we are starting to find ourselves maybe a little bit short on space, if we start to have several property pages open, and really we don't want to necessarily close one out, because obviously these are important. We may be working with something that is important, but maybe we just need a little bit more room. Well, we can actually take these property pages and collapse them. So if I just double click on the actual top part of it up here, you can see now that property page is tucked away. And again, if I had this set to lock, I can come in, continue to work, and know that that property page will not update. It'll always stay connected to what I had previously. So now I can, again, just collapse that, keep working, and if I need to get back to it, just double click, make my adjustments, and again, just keep working. Now below this, we also have a few buttons where we can actually start to, for example, save and load presets. So if we had certain settings in here that we wanted to be able to mimic, maybe across a few different objects, we can actually take these settings, save those as a preset, then go select another object and load that preset and have these different settings automatically filled in for us. Let's actually go ahead and maximize that. You can actually come in and start to collapse these different areas, which makes it a little bit nicer to just keep your work organized and start to ignore things that you may not need. Below this, we have the revert changes. Now, what this will actually allow us to do is if we have a property page that we open up and we start to come in and make some alterations, and things really don't start to go very well. We want to get this back to the way it was whenever we first opened this property page. Well, we can come in and just use that revert changes, and now it will set all of our settings back to what they were whenever we first opened this property page, or what they were set to whenever we last opened this property page. So if I were to come in and let's set this to, for example, 10 by 10. Now if I were to close out that property page, now again press enter on my keyboard to pull this property page back up. Now if I make my changes and hit revert, it reverts it back to, again, these settings that we had whenever this property page was last opened. So if we press enter, again, this will pop open our main property page and most of the information that's contained within this. Now, if we were to select our object and instead of just simply enter, if we were to press Alt enter, you can see it pulls open our property page, but it displays a lot more information in here. So essentially now this is everything that is related to our object. So the radius, the subdivisions, we have any transform options, visibility options. If we had materials assigned, we could actually start to see materials in here. So pressing Alt enter on an object allows us to take these property pages to a whole new level of detail. Now, in addition to the property pages, we also have a built-in property page that is all the way down at the bottom. So where my main command panel is, if I were to come down and choose this PPG, or property page, you can see it will actually come in and allow us to see the property pages for any objects that we have selected. So really exactly the same thing that we had with our free-floating window. It's just now that this information is docked to the side. Now, this is another situation where sometimes this Alt enter might be a good way to go, because if I were to select something like my light, there may be some situations where this property page doesn't always display everything. You can see if I select my light that we don't see things like the light color, the light intensity, and so on and so forth. So what we should be able to do is if I select this object and now press Alt enter on my keyboard, now that forces this property page to load up essentially everything. Make sure that that all gets loaded up in there. And once we're finished working, we can just switch this from our property page back to our main command panel. Alright, so that's a look at how we can start to utilize these property pages inside of Softimage.